Many of the wealthiest and most powerful Americans belong to the Catholic Church, so it may seem strange to claim any kind of victim status for Roman Catholics. But according to our next guest, anti-Catholicism is so ingrained and persistent that bigotry toward Catholics is still widely accepted. Let's take note with Philip Jenkins, Distinguished Professor of History and Religious Studies at Penn State and author of The New Anti-Catholicism, The Last Acceptable Prejudice. The book is published by Oxford Press. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
What prompted this book?
It was the fact that over the last few years there have been so many controversies involving Catholicism and the representation of Catholicism, and in most cases you'd get really outrageous expressions of opinion about the Catholic Church, and nobody seemed to recognize this as the kind of prejudice which we are rightly upset about in terms of other ethnic groups or religious groups. And so it occurred to me that what we had here was a pervasive kind of prejudice that really people were not paying attention to, which in fact seemed to be growing, which more and more books were being published about, arguing for the Catholic Church is a very dark and sinister institution. So that's what prompted it.
And in fact, you write in your book about this anti-Catholicism having a long history. We think of the Black Legends, the Inquisitions and the Crusades and those sorts of things. To what extent does that ancient history play a part in the anti-Catholicism that you say is so pervasive today?
I argue that in American history, in fact, anti-Catholicism is older than the United States. In fact, you can see the American Revolution as a response to anti-Catholic sentiment. Most historians would say that up until 1960, that's a very powerful force, and the idea is then it goes away with the election of John Kennedy. My argument is that it resurfaces in the 1970s in a different guise, and very often the weapon for that is history. People have beliefs about the Crusades, the Inquisition, the role of Pius XII in the Holocaust, and we can talk about these, but usually what people believe is very misleading, and I argue that it has a very strong religious animus. There is a historical mythology which is geared against the Church and the whole system of belief. Now,
fully 1/4 of Americans are members of the Catholic Church, and we look at a group that has wealth and power and prestige. Does the fact that they're the big kid on the block have anything to do with the fact that we accept this prejudice?
I think that that argument is sometimes made, but don't forget there are lots of other social groups who are quite wealthy and powerful, but the fact that people say dreadful things about them does not excuse the prejudice. To take an obvious example, many Jews in this country are successful, but if somebody attacks a synagogue, then quite rightly we get very upset about anti-Semitism. So the fact of power and high status does not excuse prejudice. And of course, a very large number of Catholics are not wealthy and high status. An ever-growing number of immigrant Catholics represent the core of the Church. And these are really very poor people commonly.
Okay, you refer to anti-Catholicism in your book as the thinking man's anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism of the liberals. What do you mean by that?
Okay, I wish I'd coined that phrase, but in fact I didn't. It's coined by a man called Peter Viereck. Obviously, in terms of anti-Semitism as it's existed in Europe in the 20th century, there's no comparison at all. What I'm trying to do is to compare anti-Catholicism in America with anti-Semitism in America, not the exterminationist tradition in Europe. But what I mean by that is in both cases there's a historical mythology we commonly draw on. And the assumption is if the Church does something, then we immediately have a body of stereotypes to fit this into. This is the way this group behaves. And it serves a lot of the same functions, the way anti-Semitism used to work for the political right. I argue that anti-Catholicism has now become a similar tradition for the left. So the phrase, and I wish I'd invented it, is the thinking man's anti-Semitism.
You also note that that hostile comments about Jews or blacks are considered attacks on community, but that attacks or anti-Catholic remarks are generally regarded as an attack on an institution. Why is it okay to attack a or not okay to attack a community, but okay to attack an institution?
I think what many people would argue is if you attack, for example, the NAACP, then that's not an attack on all African Americans. And that's a perfectly fair point. So why can't you attack the Catholic Church? And my response to that is other organizations do not occupy the central role in the structure of the religion that the Catholic Church occupies for Catholics. If you say, for example, I am just attacking the church, I'm just attacking the clergy, not ordinary believers, well, what does that say about the ordinary people who hold that stupid, evil, oppressive religion? How foolish, how gullible must they be? So it's almost impossible to draw that kind of line between institution and ordinary belief in this case. So I think that's often very misleading. An attack on the clergy often is an attack on ordinary belief and believers.
Now, you cite a number of examples throughout the book where you say this anti-Catholicism is evident in academia, it's evident in the arts, in newsrooms, in Hollywood. One example that stands out, and I'd like you to tell some more though, is a Halloween example.
Right.
The most comical costume award went to a group of 3 boys. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. After September 11th, many schools across the country were very alarmed at expressions of anti-Arab and anti-Muslim prejudice. Perfectly fine. So one school in Massachusetts ordered its teachers to be very careful during the Halloween event that year, and they were lucky nobody turned up dressed as Osama bin Laden, and so everyone could relax for an evening free of prejudice. And then they awarded the prize for the most comical costume to a group of 3 high school students, 2 of whom were dressed as pregnant nuns, and 1 of whom was dressed as a priest who got them pregnant. Nobody thought that was prejudice. Nobody saw it. So my concern is not that prejudice exists, but that it's acceptable, or even worse, invisible.
What are the consequences of that to the Catholic Church and beyond? The fact that it's acceptable and invisible.
I think it affects the nature of the debate about events like this. This is the only kind of prejudice that if you complain about it, the result is, in a sense, more prejudice, because if you say, you can't do that, then the response is, why are you acting as if you're living in the days of the Inquisition? Are you Torquemada? There was a lot of this when they had the controversy over art exhibits at the Brooklyn Museum of Art a couple of years ago. Complaints about offensive exhibits led to more and more offensive remarks.
A crucifix and urine, for example, was art.
That's a famous example. And you know, the analogy I would use is if somebody presented a comical or satirical work about Matthew Shepard or Martin Luther King, there would be enormous protests and enormous complaints, and I would be the first one carrying a placard outside. Why don't we have consistency? Why can't we have consistency for the sensitivities of ordinary Catholics?
Well, that's a good question. You say that we are, as a nation, very concerned about appearing to be prejudiced. We are very politically correct. Why don't we seem to care or even notice when something that's anti-Catholic is uttered, and especially by important people? When we see someone say something that's anti-black or anti-Semitic, they often lose their jobs.
Right. And I think the problem is very often the people who are most concerned about hate crimes or hate speech see the Catholic Church as a primary problem. They see it as a tool of oppression over issues like gender, sexual orientation. So, in other words, it's a political package. Instead of seeing the Catholic Church for what it is, which is actually in most ways an extremely, liberal, politically activist body, which on most issues tends to be on the left, they tend to see it as the die-hard voice of the right, which needs to be fought as a weapon of oppression.
Now, until the 1980s, you yourself were a Catholic. You refer to yourself now as a small c Catholic. You're
Right.
Episcopalian. But you talk in your book about what you call anti-Catholic Catholics.
Right.
Who falls under that category?
Okay, what I mean by this is, obviously I'm trying to draw a distinction in terms of legitimate criticism. There are many, many people who criticize an institution like the Catholic Church. The sort of example I criticize a book like James Carroll's book, Constantine's Sword, because it criticizes the whole basis of the Catholic Church and does it in what I regard as a very intemperate way that draws on these long traditions of anti-Catholic rhetoric. And so I would include that in that tradition. Other people like John Cornwell, Gary Wills, though acting on a reformist agenda, which is fine. The level of the critique is so bitter, so hostile, and so sweeping, calling for the sweeping away of basically everything which by common consent we'd call Catholic. I think that their work sometimes lapses into anti-Catholicism.
Now, what do you make of things like Sister Mary Ignatius tells you how it is, or I forget the exact title, but those sorts of things that people do see, and often until reading your book, don't even notice.
Right. Sister Mary Ignatius Explains It All to You was one of the most, what can you call it, scabrous, hostile, scandalous attacks on the Church and all its doctrines and all its ideas. No stereotype was left unturned, and this appeared as a Showtime special. My question would be, if somebody produced a film similarly, which was making fun of Matthew Shepard, Matthew Explains It All, there would be riots at the studio. What is the difference? And I have two questions. Either Sister Mary should be acceptable, but so should attacks on any other ethnic group, or Showtime should not have made and released that. Consistency.
Now, sometimes we hear that some things are just too big to be seen, and I think that's sort of what you're saying here about this anti-Catholicism.
That's my argument, and particularly in terms of the ordinary history that most people have. Even somebody like President Clinton, who is so sensitive on so many issues, made remarks about the Crusades and so on, which are based on this total historical mythology. And if you'd pointed out to him that this was any form of prejudice, he'd have been appalled. It's part of the wallpaper, it's part of the air we breathe, and that's what makes it acceptable and invisible.
Well, what's interesting is that you're not suggesting that people stop criticizing the Catholic Church altogether. What you would like to see happen is that the tone in which it's done change. What's going to help make that happen?
Mainly if Catholics themselves start organizing more and start complaining and confronting these kind of remarks. You've got groups like the Catholic League now, which is based on the Jewish Anti-Defamation League, very active, very well organized. I think that could make a difference, but it's a very long way to go. Okay,
thanks so much for being with us. We've been talking with Philip Jenkins. His new book is The New Anti-Catholicism, published by Oxford Press. For Take Note, I'm Patty Satalia.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.